Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a brutal massacre following a family wedding leaves 3 dead and communities living in fear.
It was scary to think that he was going to come back to this area. Who knows what he could have done.
A sadistic killer who taunted the police and vowed he would never be caught.
He started writing, telling us that the police were no more than Boy Scouts. They couldn't catch him. He was a master of disguise.
And the vital forensic evidence that would tie the triple murderer to the scene of the crime.
We also found cheese in the fridge that had bite marks in it, and have it examined by a forensic odontologist.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
I was actually in Wakefield with the Regional Crime Squad when I got the call from the head of CID to attend at a door where there'd been a murder. There was obviously going to be a need for a major incident room to be set up and an investigation to be run from that location. And so I came straight to here. The house itself is just on the left of here, behind a lot of this foliage, and it looks nothing like it did on the day that I attended when we were called to the incident. You never know what you're coming to, so I was always thinking, what are the logistics of investigating this crime and how are we going to deal with it from this particular location?
In 1983, Detective Chief Inspector Mick Burdess was one of South Yorkshire's most experienced detectives. But when he arrived at the scene in Dore, an affluent suburb on the outskirts of Sheffield, he was greeted with a scene that he had never witnessed before.
When I arrived, there would probably be a sergeant and a couple of officers. And then gradually, scenes of crime officers arrived, and then others came. They would have found a horrendous scene, really, because there were the bodies of 3 people. On the staircase itself, there was the body of Basil, who had been attacked on the stairs. His wife, Avril, was in the downstairs bedroom, and Richard, the son, he was in one of the bedrooms upstairs, and called for the officers from the Forensic Science Service and from our own crime scene officers to attend and deal with sealing the scene to prevent it from being contaminated by too many feet and too many bodies inside. And we effectively were preserving evidence. One of the things you do when you arrive at a crime scene of this nature is to imagine the route that might have been taken, what implements have been used, what else has happened in that scene itself. So you try to build a case in your mind of what actually took place. These were extensive premises because almost every room in the house had been part used by the person responsible for the murder. You can't trample all over the place because you'll damage and destroy valuable forensic evidence.
Just hours after a family wedding at the house, 3 victims had been viciously stabbed to death, while a 4th had been subjected to a sustained sexual assault, but had been spared by the killer. For Mick Burdis and his team of officers, the first task was to discover who the victims were and understand more about them.
Basil Leitner was the senior partner in his own law firm in Sheffield. He was a solicitor and a very well-respected member of the public. His wife, Avril, was a psychologist who worked with Sheffield Council, a child psychologist, and again had many, many clients in the Sheffield area and very highly regarded. And Richard, the son who was murdered, was a barrister who worked in London and out of London chambers. And so they were all a very highly respected family and a well-liked family. There'd been a wedding here of the daughter of the Leitner family, and there'd been 200 guests entertained in a marquee that had been erected in the back garden. And in the evening itself, the guests dispersed to the various places, and it was, well, a happy time that was being celebrated by a family.
But what has happened to turn this joyous evening in a leafy city suburb into a bloodbath? As specialist forensic teams searched the scene for vital clues, news of the murders began to spread.
Back then, I was a reporter at the Yorkshire Post, based up in Leeds. And I remember on that day, just as routine a day as newsrooms ever are, you know, you get the call and there's something happening in Sheffield. We're not entirely sure what it is just yet, but be ready. Then you find out that there's certainly something major happening in Sheffield. In the car, drive down so that you're on the site. And I came down here with a colleague.
With other journalists arriving from across the country, Alan set to work on the story.
They were a prosperous, comfortably off family, living in this really very pleasant house in a very pleasant part of the city. They must have had a pretty enjoyable lifestyle up until that day. And then, bang, suddenly everything changes.
By the morning, Yorkshire would be waking up to news of a multiple murder. News that would stir horrific memories of another notorious killer.
The effect it had on South Yorkshire was remarkable, because you've got to remember again that we were less than 2 years after the arrest of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who of course was caught here in Sheffield. It seemed to bring a lot of memories flooding back, and overnight women were being protected by menfolk who would insist on picking them up, dropping them off, escorting them to here, taking them there. So there was this almost overnight changing behaviour across the city. You know, you could tell it was happening, and that was a direct result of all these memories, recent memories, being reawakened.
Alan was covering one of the biggest stories of his career, while Mick and his team knew a vicious killer was still at large. The race was on to find evidence that could reveal who they were looking for and where they might be. Sheffield, South Yorkshire, the Steel City, a place that back in the 1980s kept police officers on their toes.
It was a busy industrial city. I knew Sheffield because my grandparents lived there. My mother came from Sheffield. The crimes were mainly what every other city would experience: burglary, assaults. Saturday nights and Friday nights were busy nights. But generally it was the type of crime that you would expect in any conurbation.
By 1983, Sheffield was gripped by rising unemployment as its once mighty steel industry declined. But there remained pockets of affluence untouched by the city's economic woes. One such place was the upper middle-class suburb of Dore. Only 6 miles from the city centre, its village atmosphere and location on the fringe of the Peak District National Park attracted wealthy professionals.
You know, Dore's this leafy, pleasant little suburb. It's not the sort of place that news happened.
But it was here, on Dore Road, that the peace of suburban life was shattered with news of the triple murder of the Lakener family, just hours after a family wedding at their home. Now detectives had the task of finding out who had been in the house and whether any of them had information that could help catch a killer.
At the wedding, there were 200 guests, and there would be many other people involved in the catering and the preparation for the wedding.
While detectives sought statements from guests, crime scene examiners scoured the property for forensic clues. For most police forces in the early 80s, DNA analysis was more science fiction than forensic tool. So the CSI team first relied on an old-fashioned technique: fingerprints.
On the worktop in the kitchen was a bottle of champagne, and we were able to see that there was fingerprints on that bottle, and we needed to identify them. They could easily have been part of the family, but at the same time, they could have been the fingerprints of the killer.
That fingerprint was a vital first clue, but without a digitized national database, it could take days, if not weeks, to match the print to known offenders. However, the CSI team had discovered another forensic clue to accompany the print.
But we also found cheese in the fridge, and that cheese had bite marks in it. And we were able to take that cheese and have it examined by a forensic odontologist.
And even in 1983, detectives knew that the indents left in the cheese could reveal who it was. Simon Crew is an expert in forensic odontology.
From analysing the marks in the bitten food, the odontologist should be able to compose an idea of what sort of teeth arrangements may have made them. So they will identify marks that must have been made by adult teeth. In fact, with the cheese being such a better recording material than the skin that we're used to, you have got a wonderful three-dimensional mark of the passage of the teeth through the cheese. So there's much more information in a bitten piece of cheese than there is in a bruise on skin.
Experts were quickly able to obtain a clear impression of the teeth. This, along with the fingerprint, could put a potential suspect at the scene of the murders. But this forensic evidence wouldn't be of any use until the police had a suspect in custody.
There is no central database of teeth, and there's no magical way of looking anything up. It has to be good old-fashioned detective work. But the police will come up with somebody that they suspect must have made this mark. and then a comparison can be made between the teeth of the suspect and the marks in the food.
So police had two important clues. But there was one more discovery in an upstairs bedroom.
When we searched the house, in the bed itself, we were able to find what appeared to be an imprint of blood, and it appeared to have come through a bandage because you could see the mesh in the way that the blood was imprinted into the sheets on the bed.
In 1983, blood couldn't be simply tested for DNA, but the blood grouping could be determined. Forensic analysis of the bloody sheets would reveal a relatively rare combination of blood groups that only 1 in 50,000 in the UK shared. All this information was fed into the murder incident room. And within 24 hours of being live, detectives hunting the killer received crucial intelligence.
I received a telephone call from a friend who had been one of my detectives in Doncaster years earlier, who was then the detective inspector at Selby Police Station. And he told me that a man that they had charged with the rape of a lady, and that it was very likely the type of crime that he would be involved in.
The man's name was Arthur Hutchinson. He'd been on the run for 3.5 weeks, and he was rapidly becoming the prime suspect. But who was he? Hutchinson had grown up on the tough Oughton Manor estate in Hartlepool. As a young man, he already had a bad reputation. But that reputation wasn't confined to the northeast. 78 miles away, in the quaint North Yorkshire town of Skipton, his nephew Dino also knew of his uncle's background.
When I was younger, my dad made me aware that he did have this half-brother Arthur, and he was sort of a bit of a black sheep of the family. He was involved in petty crime, bit of a local hard man.
As is often the case with families, rumour swirled about the outcast member.
There's a story that my Uncle Arthur had a bit of a disagreement with one of his elder sisters, and I think he stabbed her in the hand. Whether that sort of tells you anything about the future Arthur, or whether it's just sibling rivalry at its worst, I'm not really sure.
Arthur soon appeared in Skipton, looking for a fresh start. But a row between the brothers over unpaid rent would escalate into violence.
I think they went down and there was sort of some major altercation, and my father demanded that he leave the house and evicted him. But anyway, Arthur bore a bit of a grudge about this.
Dino's dad evicted Arthur from the property, but Arthur reacted in the most terrifying way possible, by trying to kill him as he travelled home from work on his motorcycle.
My father worked night shift at a local engineering company. He used to travel 5 or 6 miles on his motorbike. Yeah, so this is the bridge where Arthur was waiting that evening to take a pot shot at my dad. You've got a good line of vision here. He obviously pre-planned it. Probably see about 700 metres there, so he would have only been going at 20, 25 miles an hour, so we'd have had time to sort of take aim, wait for him to get closer. Took a shot. Luckily, it missed. I think my father came off his bike. Case of attempted murder, which he was imprisoned for.
Found guilty, he served 5 years, but by September 1983, Arthur Hutchinson was back in the community. A free man with a plan. He'd read an article in the national news about a woman in Selby who had come into some money, and he decided to pay her a visit.
He had this ability to believe that he would be overbearingly attractive to these ladies, and that every lady that he met would want to sleep with him and be with him. And he was convinced that he would be able to persuade this woman to marry him and set up life together.
But Hutchinson wasn't a hopeless romantic. Before executing his plan, he stopped outside the house, lurked in the distance, and watched.
When he was watching the house, he saw that this lady had a boyfriend. So he decided that he would dig 2 graves in a field near to the house.
Hutchinson's murderous plan never came to fruition. The boyfriend left, but Hutchinson broke into the house and raped the woman. Incredibly, the next morning, she talked her way out of Hutchinson's clutches and raised the alarm. Once again, he was facing a lengthy prison sentence. However, this cunning criminal was determined to avoid another spell inside at any cost.
Now, the courtroom at Selby was immediately above the police station, and it was being decorated. And on the day that he was due to appear in court, he was going to be moved from the cell area to an office in the building, which was going to be used as a temporary court. But unfortunately, he managed to find the staircase that led from the cell area at the police station up into the dock of the court. And when he climbed up these stairs, he found that there were decorators and scaffolding, and he was able to escape from the dock and crashed through a big window and landed on some barbed wire and then over into a field at the side of a railway line.
It was the classic escape bit, you know, I want to go to the toilet, and they put him in the toilet and he escapes through the back window. You know, you couldn't have made that up, really.
Hutchinson, injured from the fall from the courtroom window, had escaped and was on the loose. His leg was lacerated, his trousers ripped. But Sheffield was more than 60 miles from Selby. Could it really be him who had made his way to Dull Road and killed the Lakeners? And if so, why? In 1983, police in South Yorkshire were investigating the brutal and apparently random murder of the Lakener family. The 3 victims had been stabbed to death in their own home after celebrating a family wedding, while a 4th had been left clinging to life. Detectives had found numerous clues at the scene, including a fingerprint on a champagne bottle. Sent away for expert analysis, they'd got a match: a known offender, Arthur Hutchinson. But it wasn't just the fingerprints that pointed to Arthur. The surviving victim, in the care of a hospital, spoke to police, and despite the harrowing experience, was able to tell detectives what she knew.
She'd had such a traumatic experience of being handcuffed, the physical and the sexual assault on her, and she'd been handcuffed overnight, and she'd had to climb over her father's body to get down the stairs. So we had to be very, very conscious of the difficulty that she was having mentally as well as physically. And we assigned one of our female detectives to work with her and to be very close to her. And this was long before the days of family liaison officers, but it was the obvious thing to do.
Remarkably, she was able to provide a sketch artist with a detailed description of her attacker.
That was almost as lifelike as a photograph probably better even than a photograph, because it had detail in it that was really, really lifelike. It was an amazing picture, and we were very, very successful and very, very fortunate to have that sort of picture as part of our investigation process.
That picture was released, and they named him as the prime suspect, indeed the only suspect, with the usual warning not to approach him. But if you see him, or if you know anything, call us. Call it in. Don't approach him.
It was the community in Yorkshire that Mick wanted to speak to most of all. Arthur Hutchinson was on the run, and chances are he was still in the county.
Good to see you again after all this time. Yes. Yeah.
And he turned to then Yorkshire Post journalist Alan for help.
It was a strange inquiry. It was different to any of the other inquiries I'd ever done.
Well, there was that urgency, wasn't there? And the fact that you named him early on, you were so confident that you got the right man.
Well, we knew we'd got the right man because of the incident that had happened in Selby and the escape from the Selby courtroom. So we knew we were onto the right man.
You know, he's out there, he's on the loose.
That's right.
Nobody's any idea what he might do now.
No, quite. Of course, when we published his name, that really brought us major problems, because we got such a huge response. Hundreds of calls and hundreds of letters that we got into the incident room telling us that they'd actually seen him or thought they'd seen him. I mean, many of them were genuine but wrong. Some were not necessarily genuine and caused a bit of problem, but in the main it was quite remarkable, the number of calls we got. Yeah.
I think the other big standout from this one was just the sheer, evilness of it.
Phone calls did start coming into Mick's incident room. People who thought they'd seen Arthur Hutchinson all across the north of England.
I think we were all, police, journalists, everybody involved, really, we were all sort of on tenterhooks, waiting, half expecting there to be a call to say, they found a body, they found 2 bodies, there's been an incident in X town or, Y place. I think one of the big police concerns while he was on the run about what his state of mind was and what he might do out of a sense of desperation.
Arthur Hutchinson had vanished, and his days on the run turned into weeks. And time was making him more confident, even goading the officers chasing him in a letter to the Yorkshire Post.
He started writing, telling us that the police were no more than Boy Scouts. They couldn't catch him. He was a master of disguise. That was another phrase he used. And he'd walked past the police several times, disguised, and they never spotted him, and they were never going to catch him. It was all this taunting, I'm the master, I'm invincible, sort of stuff. And he also created this identity for himself of the Fox. For us, this was great. Because, as a journalist, normally you sit at the end of the police table a bit like the family dog waiting to be tossed a few scraps of information, to keep you going for tomorrow morning's paper. And, we were on tenterhooks now. We were waiting for the postman to arrive every morning because we were wondering, would there be another letter from Arthur Hutchinson?
In fact, the letters from Arthur Hutchinson to the Yorkshire Post made this a unique investigation.
And from a journalist's point of view, that was just great because, we got to open the letters before you'd even seen them.
That's right.
By the time you got your hands on them, we knew what was in them.
Yeah.
And that's not the way it normally works. Normally, we have a system where the police tell us what you want us to know. But this time, we got full access. It was great.
You're right. I seem to remember we sent a motorcycle runner up to collect the letters.
Yeah.
It was quite a unique experience, really, to see these letters and to understand them. And of course, because he was on the run, we didn't know where he was.
Those letters gave little away to the detectives in the incident room. They analysed the postmarks, attempted to learn where they'd been sent from, but it didn't lead them to his hideout. Detectives knew that Hutchinson may stop at nothing. And as the manhunt dragged on, fear was growing.
My dad was aware that he'd tried to kill him once, and the police were aware of this, so they sent 2 policemen round to our house. And for several weeks while Arthur was on the run, we had 2 policemen sitting down watching TV with us and sharing dinners. But it was quite shocking that it was my half uncle that was responsible for this terrible crime.
While police in Skipton were on high alert, soon reports emerged of Hutchinson being seen in various towns and cities.
He was actually covering a lot of ground, and and we know that he was in Barnsley, he was in 2 or 3 places in North Nottinghamshire, in guest houses and the like, in Manchester, in York, and in Scarborough. So he was crisscrossing almost the whole of the north of England. He was certainly stealing food. He was certainly moving around. His own account is that he slept during the day and moved at night, just trying to stay one step ahead of the police. And of course, the police were becoming increasingly anxious to get him back under lock and key.
He boasted about being able to live off the land and eat dandelions, but he could eat plenty of other things besides dandelions, and I'm sure that he got good rich pickings from some of these places. After all, he was on the run for quite a long time, and he was able to avoid arrest, even to communicate with newspapers about what he was doing.
But it would be his arrogant letters to the newspapers which would lead to his downfall. If Hutchinson was writing letters, he must know they're being printed, and that must mean he was reading the newspaper. If the police could get a story printed that could lure Arthur in a certain direction, it could help them catch him.
We had connections with his family, and we were able to discuss these issues with his mother and his family. His mother was not a well person and was due to have some hospital treatment for a heart condition, and she was agreeable that we should arrest Hutchinson as quickly as we could.
Detectives suspected that a story about Hutchinson's ailing mother would have the desired effect of flushing the fugitive out.
They knew that when he latched onto this story, he would begin to make his way home. He had a strong bond with his mother. Perhaps because she was the one who had always stood by him. Most of the rest of his family by this stage had completely disowned him. They wanted no more of Arthur Hutchinson. We didn't realise at the time quite how good, how brilliant the police operation was. So he began making his way back to Hartlepool, where she was living. And slowly but surely, the net tightened.
While detectives set their trap for residents living on the Oughton Manor estate, the prospect of Arthur Hutchinson returning to his native northeast was something that filled many with dread. Tracy Mitchell was a teenager in the 80s and had regularly come into contact with Hutchinson.
Me and my mum would walk down this way and go through this alleyway, go in the shop, and then we'd come out, and Arthur Hutchinson always seemed to be lurking about and always used to come over talking. And he used to make me feel really uncomfortable. I didn't like him. He'd be smiling, but his eyes weren't. I just didn't like his eyes. It might sound strange, but that's just how I felt. Like, it made me uncomfortable.
According to Tracy, Hutchinson once threatened and then chased her and her friends, a terrifying experience for the then 13-year-old girl.
The older you get, the more you think what could have happened if he'd caught us at the time. It was scary then, but more so, I think, now, because you understand more what he could have done to you, because he's obviously capable of it.
With every day Hutchinson remained at large, tension on the estate grew.
There was a sense of fear when he was on the run that he would come back, because a lot of people thought he would come back to see his mum because he was very close to his mum, I think. And who knows what he could have done.
With communities across northern England gripped by fear, police officers from across the north were also making their way to Hartlepool, where they were sure Hutchinson would soon arrive. But would he fall for the bait, or did he have one final flourish up his sleeve? In November 1983, police from South Yorkshire were closing in on the man suspected of murdering 3 members of the same family in a brutal attack. Arthur Hutchinson had labelled himself the Fox after going to ground following the savage stabbings of the Leitner family in Dore, near Sheffield. Detectives had tracked him to the Midlands, Manchester and Yorkshire. Now they were preparing to close in on the killer after concocting a plan to lure him back to his hometown of Hartlepool.
We were able to set up a trap to try and catch him. We knew that Hutchinson was making his way into the area.
But while Mick and his detectives finalised plans to ensnare the Fox, a farm near Hartlepool was already picking up suspicious activity.
You have a sensor that crosses the farm lane, that if that sensor's broken, then there's a bleeper goes off in my parents' bedroom. And this sensor started to go off at the same time every morning.
Claire Bladen remembers the mystery over what was causing the alarm to sound.
So it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and when it had happened a few days in a row, my father set his alarm so that he was awake, ready for the sensor going off. And when he looked out of the window as the sensor went off, he saw the silhouette of a man walking briskly. So he was dressed in camouflage type clothing, the green colour, and because he was walking away, he couldn't see his face. But he was just walking briskly up our lane. So of course we put 2 and 2 together and we thought, is that connected?
Just a couple of days later, her farm would be the centre of a massive nationwide manhunt.
So the first thing I remember is being woken up by the police at 6 o'clock in the morning. They knocked on the front door to ask us to stay locked in the farmhouse and to ask my dad permission to search the farm. When I looked out the bedroom window, all I could see was this line of police. And if you go beyond this grass field and into the cornfield beyond, and you just look across the horizon, you've got from the trees on that side, right across to the large tree in the middle over there, and they were just literally side by side, all in uniform. Just so many of them. There must have been hundreds of police, not just across there, but down the road and then round the back of the farm as well. It's a bit like being in a film, really. Down the bottom there, you can see that large hedge. Underneath it is the brook that flows fresh water along underneath it, so it probably goes down another 3 feet. And then if you scan your eyes across the top, you can see the trees on the top there. That's how far it goes. Everyone was in position, so the police officer that was in charge of the whole investigation was asking if the armed police were all in position, and they said yes, they were. And then the dog handlers asked permission to release the dogs, and the permission was granted, and the dogs went in, and you could hear all the kerfuffle and the men shouting and running, and as what would go with that kind of scene. And then eventually, after a few minutes, he was arrested.
It was amazing news when we learnt the fact that he'd been arrested, and we were. There was a lot of jubilation in the incident room at the time. It is a great relief that you've made an arrest of somebody as dangerous as this.
To think that we were floating around the farm as young ladies, to think that that could easily have happened to us, it's just not worth thinking about. It does give you goose pimples.
After 39 days on the run, the prime suspect, Arthur Hutchinson, had been arrested. But that didn't mean the police work was over. Now Mick and his team needed to gather the remaining evidence that could prove he was responsible for the Leitner's murder. This was in an era before complex DNA evidence, so they relied on more primitive methods to tie Hutchinson to the scene. First was a fingerprint found on a champagne bottle, which they knew matched their suspect. But on its own, it wasn't enough proof. Detectives also had teeth impressions made by the killer after he'd bitten into a piece of cheese. With Hutchinson now in custody, a fresh imprint could be taken for comparison.
The cast of the teeth is offered up against either the original piece of food or, more likely, a cast of the food. And there would be enough similarity between the edges of the teeth and the marks in the food.
The value of the examination and the forensic examination was to find the bite marks and to look at the shape of the bite mark and to find the fingerprints on the champagne bottle, which were conclusive forensic evidence that Hutchinson was the person responsible for this crime.
And last of all, detectives had found blood on bedsheets in an upstairs bedroom, which forensic tests had identified as a blood grouping combination shared by only 1 in 50,000 people. When Arthur was arrested, they found a cut on his leg, and tests carried out in custody confirmed he shared the same rare blood group combination found at the scene. Science could prove without doubt that Hutchinson had been in the property, and together with the evidence from the survivor, everything suggested he was responsible for the murders.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case. The weight of forensic evidence ultimately is what trapped Hutchinson.
At Durham Crown Court in September 1984, Hutchinson faced trial for triple murder and rape. It took just 4 hours for a jury to find him guilty on all counts. Initially sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years, his sentence was later increased by the Home Secretary to a whole life tariff, meaning he'll die behind bars.
You can put together a really strong argument that says he can never be safe among normal people. No matter how old he is, there will always be a flicker of doubt about letting him back into society. Personally, I'm more comfortable with him behind bars.
As far as I'm aware, Arthur's never shown any remorse. He's never admitted to the crimes. But the fact that you can't hold your hand up and say that you've done it, you're not coming out of prison.
You can't get into the mind of these people because of his fantasies, because you don't know what the next fantasy is going to be. And he was such a dangerous man. He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
Putting Hutchinson behind bars couldn't change the fate of the Leitner family. For them, it was too late. But forensic science had ensured that Arthur Hutchinson wouldn't harm anyone else. Thanks to science, one of Britain's most dangerous killers had been stopped in his tracks.